Thank you so much, Cecilia, and to all the team for everything that you're doing in the background. It's a huge amount of work and we're all very grateful. So I'm delighted to be here. I'm sorry we're not in a room together with pencils and pieces of paper, cups of tea and biscuits. I'd love to know each of your names and what drives you, your passions, your dreams, and maybe that will happen another time. But for today, I'm going to share my screen and move through some ideas with you, and then there'll also be some invitations for you to have a go. So if you've got a piece of paper and a pen, pencil, crayon, chalk, whatever you like to use handy, that would be great. We'll use the Q&A button, which is anonymous. I'll only see it and Cecilia, and we won't use any names. So you can feel very free to share without any fear that because this is being recorded, your name will be used anywhere. It certainly won't. Which again makes it slightly less personable, and for that I'm sorry, but very, very glad to meet you here. I'm based in Southend-on-Sea in Essex, where it's very sunny today, and feel very honoured to be talking about some creative writing approaches. As you heard in that very lovely introduction there, I have written some books about my own lived experience. I come here from the perspective of a psychologist and from the perspective of someone with lived experience of BDD and of eating struggles as well. So I hope to speak through both of those lenses this afternoon. All right, so I'm going to share my screen, and unless I hear from Cecilia, I'll assume that it works. It just sometimes takes a moment to come up. Yeah, okay, lovely. I'm hoping that that's visible for you. So writing because the page listens, a bit of an exploration of some therapeutic approaches. It's just something in the chat. I have the chat open at the same time. I'm learning. This is good. Okay. So let's see. There we are. So what are we aiming to do? Very broad and brief, because we've only got an hour together. Overview of the narrative therapy approach. Consider some things within that: letters, stories, and poems. I'd love to go into diary writing and all sorts, but we simply do not have the time. And then we'll have a go at some activities for ourselves. And whether you're a therapist, someone with lived experience, a loved one, hope you can find something here that's going to be helpful to you. All right. So if we think about narrative approaches and that narrative frame, it's very much coming from the premise of human problems come from, arise from and are maintained by oppressive stories that dominate a person's life. And we'll talk a bit more about that in a minute. And the fact that we story our own lives, don't we? We use language to talk about ourselves. And the way we story our lives and our identities can be very different to the way that we're storied by others. And you might take a moment here to consider, both in this space, but if you're watching the recording later, you might like to pause here and have a bit of time for reflection on the ways in which you story yourself. How do you talk about yourself, both within your own head, but also with others? And is that different from the way you are storied, particularly by significant others, both now, presently, but also in the past? And thinking about ways that you were storied within your family of origin can be interesting. And those stories can be really sticky, can't they? You know, if you're the clumsy one of the family, or the vivacious one of the family, or the shy one of the family, or the one in the family who's the peacekeeper. Even if that changes through your teenage years and adult life, it can be that the family narrative as such doesn't move on. And therefore, perhaps sometimes we fall into old stories of ourselves when we're with family members of origin. We become that story again that was very much perpetuated perhaps when we were growing up. So something to consider there. And actually any dominant or oppressive narratives, so narratives that somehow stifle our true self, our full sense of who we are, can actually take over our felt sense of identity. And within the narrative approach, there's the idea of providing a space for the authoring of alternative stories that may have previously been marginalised. So here are some examples of some dominant oppressive narratives that we might assimilate as our own. So a dominant oppressive narrative that might be present in our culture, in our socio-political context, in our family of origin, could be something like, you're only worthy of love if you look a certain way. And imagine if that gets internalized, it becomes, I am only worthy of love if I look a certain way. Sorry, Cecilia said here that someone can't hear me. Could everybody else hear me? Can you put something there and just let Cecilia know? I'm sorry for that person. I hope you can resolve any technical issues that you're having. So let's have a look. It's good to, if no one can hear me, that's probably, oh, there we are, others can hear. All right, I'm sorry for that person, and I hope that can get resolved for you, or you can watch it later, perhaps when your sound is fixed. So if you internalize that, I am only worthy of love if I have clear skin, or if I'm a certain weight, or if my ears are pinned back, or whatever it is. This idea of being less of a person if a particular perceived flaw or defect is present, and there's a distressing preoccupation with that, which we know is characteristic of body dysmorphic struggles. And this idea of you are not good enough as you are, which seems to be very, very central. I don't think I've ever come across a person with a diagnosis of BDD who has said, I'm good enough as I am. I feel I'm a good person, actually. More often than not, there's this sense of, I'm not good enough. I'm not good enough for this person, that person, and also I don't feel that I'm good enough within myself. And I'm sure you can think of others, and you can feel free to put those in the Q&A if you want to share any other dominant oppressive narratives. And again, it's anonymous, that you feel you might have grown up with, or that you've assimilated in some way. And these dominant oppressive narratives can maintain the BDD, maintain the struggle. If my felt sense of myself is that I'm not good enough unless I've got clear skin, then I'm going to work very hard in order to clear my skin up, in order to become good enough. And of course, the master plan fails to deliver. I clear up my skin, and yet somehow I still don't feel good enough, because of course that felt sense of not good enoughness isn't about the skin. It's been pinned onto or projected onto the skin, but it runs much deeper than that. And therefore I might find myself becoming preoccupied with a different narrative of myself. So now I'm not good enough unless I lose weight, or whatever it is. All right, and I can see it's very nice of you. Thank you to be popping things in the Q&A. You can feel free to continue to do that. Okay, and this very much relates to the power, threat, meaning framework, which I really recommend you looking up. There's a truncated version if you Google it. So it's like 400 pages or something, but there's a shorter version. And it's an alternative paradigm in terms of thinking about mental distress, thinking about mental health diagnoses, BDD being one of them, as being sane responses to an insane reality based on how power has operated in our lives. So thinking about those power differentials, what threat that power has posed to us, and what meaning we've made of that threat. So we can think about BDD in a sense as the desperate bid or fight for survival, actually. I often say it's not a disorder, but an attempt at order, a desperate bid for survival. And if we begin to understand what we are surviving against, what threat are we feeling, what is our meaning, then perhaps some of the underlying aspects of our struggle with BDD can surface and be given the airtime that would be useful for them to have. So often by the time we come to therapy or seeking help, we've kind of developed a dominant story about who we are as a person. It's kind of a deficit story. So often that deficit story within BDD is focused around, it is focused around appearance, that thin identity conclusion of ourselves. I am my nose, I am my skin, I am my weight, I am my hair, or whatever it is. And that can feel very problem saturated. It's something I need to fix. Narrative approaches say, well, actually, identity is fluid, dynamic, and contextual. And the way that our ideas of ourselves erupt and emerge is contingent on our life experiences, on our family context, our cultural context, our socio-political context, the language practices that we're recruited into, the way we language and story ourselves, as I mentioned before, and that we're storied by others. And the idea is that the person is not the problem. I am not the problem. You are not the problem. The problem is the problem. So you are good as you are, and I am good as I am. And there's this thing that we call BDD. That's the issue, not you as a person, not me as a person. It's that externalizing aspect. There is this thing called BDD that does emerge within all of those different contexts. And we need to look to all of those contexts in order to understand the experience of that person. But that person is not the BDD. That person is a rich and diverse person that has so much life experience and so much within them outside of that experience of BDD, even though in the thick of the struggle, as I know personally, it can feel very much like that is all that we are, and is who we are. So very much thinking about how power and threat leads us to internalize impossible societal standards. When we feel under threat, we yearn and seek to belong. There's safety in numbers. And so we look to our environment to find ways of doing that. And if that threat is, I'm not going to belong unless I look a certain way, it's understandable that we would then aspire to look in that certain way, and more than aspire, become very, very distressed by the sense that we may not fit that. So therefore, it's really important to consider the meaning we give to our experiences and the stories we tell ourselves about ourselves, the language we use, as I mentioned, and the types of words we use to story our lives. When we say I am, what do we follow that with? Are we languaging our felt sense of identity with compassion and kindness, or are we pretty hard on ourselves? And where does that language come from? You know, if I change that I am to you are, I might find that some of those things I hear in my head, I am ugly. If I change that to you are ugly, I suddenly hear a different voice. It could be the voice of a primary caregiver, a teacher, a bully. And we realise that that's come from somewhere. It isn't intrinsic to who we are. And those marginalised stories as well. So there can be dominant stories that can come again from our family of origin, from bullies, from different experiences, work colleagues. And actually, how would we describe it differently to our work colleague, our mother, our father? How would we describe ourselves differently to the ways we might have heard ourselves described that have been less than helpful? And then just a little nod to the social graces. There's lots of G's and R's and A's and C's and E's and S's. It's not graces like that, as I'm sure you know. It's things like gender, race, ethnicity. We heard Amita talk about some of these aspects this morning on the main stage. So thinking about how our gender, our felt sense of our gender and our sexuality and our ethnic background and all of those things play into any felt sense of threat we've experienced, but also the way we story ourselves and how these aspects have informed us experiencing BDD, which is a desperately difficult thing to experience. So, okay, let's launch in then. So we're just going to take a little time on each one. We're going to think about letters, stories, and poems. Left my favourite till the last. So letters. Maybe take a moment to think about what meaningful letters you've received in your life. Some instantly come to my mind in my own. What made this letter or these letters meaningful? And did you keep them and reread them? Did you have a box somewhere with special letters that you've received? And if so, why? What made you hang on to them? What made you reread them? And then just a thought about how letter writing has changed in the current age that we're living in. So often now I find myself writing emails where I would have written letters in the past. Is it the same? I know it doesn't feel the same to send them, and neither does it feel the same to receive them. There's something about the letter on a mat with a stamp and handwritten that's very special. And thinking about that difference between something that's typed or computer created or printed, and something that's actually emerged from someone's hand and a pen, if you like. Not saying that one is better than the other, just noticing that things have changed, and that might sometimes have an impact on our experience of receiving letters in different forms. So therapeutic letter writing is based in the work of the fathers of narrative therapy, and we've just touched a little bit on that approach. So David Epstein, one of the fathers of narrative therapy, writes, and I'll read it because I think it's really a great quote. "Conversation is by its very nature ephemeral. After a particularly meaningful session, a therapeutic session, a client walks away aglow with provocative new thoughts, but a few blocks, yards, streets away, the exact words that had struck home as so profound may already be hard to recall. But the words in a letter don't fade and disappear the way conversation does. They endure through time and space, bearing witness to the work of therapy and immortalizing it." So there's something about the written word that's immortalizing. And I found this in writing of some of my experiences of anorexia and BDD in a book I wrote a few years ago called False Bodies, True Selves, because suddenly it exists there for people to read and reread. And the tangibility of it was quite frightening, I think. And it can also be very liberating and very powerful. And I think with BDD and OCD and similar experiences, that the mind can be so preoccupied that we might have had a really good therapeutic session, or been alone in our bedroom and had a sudden revelation or a moment of hopefulness. And then 10 seconds later, it's gone because we're back onto perhaps the ruminative or the repetitive thoughts or the compulsions. If it's written down, then we can come back to it. So they can also serve to consolidate that alternative story, to thicken the narrative. We spoke about how we can come to a thin identity conclusion of ourselves. Actually, therapeutic letter writing tries to broaden that out and think about all aspects of the person and reflect all of that within the letter. If it's written from, for example, a therapist to a client, but it can also be that we write letters ourselves, and we'll come to that. So here are some of the purposes. I won't go through each of them. The important thing to say is that if they're used within therapy, and you're here perhaps interested in it as a therapist, that really the client should be the final editor. They should be given editorial rights. If they want to come back to you with their own letter and suggest alternatives, or they'd like things to be changed in that letter, that's really important. So we're trying to reduce the power differential. We're trying to give the power and the agency back to that person. And because that written word can be so stark and powerful, we want to get it right. Highlighting forgotten abilities and values, so that person's hopes, dreams, desires beyond anything related to appearance. Proposing new narratives, thickening that story, building trust as well, and highlighting those aspects that might be talking to a new story. Somewhere in all of our hearts, however absorbing the experience of something like BDD or OCD is a sense of who we are at the very core of ourselves. And when those remembrances, if you like, bubble up, we can capture those in writing so that we can remind ourselves in those very desperate and difficult moments. That can be incredibly powerful. I'm sure you can think of others. And they might include these things. It's important to use the language that the person uses to story their experience. Language is really important in the narrative approach. So if a person describes something a certain way, yes, we might be curious about that, and maybe even sometimes challenge it a bit, particularly if they're using very sort of a deficit or problem saturated language about themselves, but important also to respect it. And then this aspect of externalizing. So we spoke about how you are not the problem, I'm not the problem is the problem. So thinking about using language like when BDD comes to visit rather than when you engage in safety behaviours, or when BDD draws you into the mirror for hours rather than when you spend hours in front of the mirror. It's almost taking not the responsibility away, because it's important to recognise our agency, our control in some of these aspects, but also to recognise that there's this thing that we call BDD, this set of experiences that have merged within a particular context that are impacting us in a certain way, and it's almost like it comes to us, not from within us, because intrinsically we're good as we are. And I repeat that purposefully. Increasing that sense of empowerment and agency, sometimes we're a bit afraid of humour, we think we're going to offend people, but use a sensitive humour with ourselves and others. The idea of being an editor and the idea of writing back as well, if desired, having that as an open invitation. So in some sense, the letter's a scaffold, sort of helping a person from one space, one story, perhaps into another, supporting that journey. Might think about a star resource, and particularly something, and reflective questions can be used that the person's identified as a strength within themselves, and perhaps how could you use this? How can we use these strengths within our struggle with BDD? So if one of my strengths is the capacity for compassion, and that tends to come out with other people, how can I turn that around and extend compassion to myself? This is something I'm still learning very much in my own personal life, and something I'm considering. If we have that capacity for compassion for others, we do have that capacity. Let's see if we can turn it around and just even a little bit extend it to ourselves. All right, and finally with letter writing, just to say that it can be particularly helpful in terms of building the relationship if we're thinking about it in a therapeutic context, because as I said, the spoken word can be quite difficult to digest. If you've got 1,000 thoughts in your head, or your train of thought is very much stuck on, for example, your distressing preoccupation with your dark circles under your eyes, it's going to be very difficult to hear what a therapist, a loved one, a friend is telling you or helping you to reflect upon. So having it written down can be really, really helpful and also supportive to the process. And it's empowering to think that if we're given if someone says something to us, they can't take it back, can they? You can't suck the words back in. But if someone gives us a letter and we don't like it, we can burn it, we can tear it up, we can throw it into the bin. There's something also quite empowering about that. Okay, and as I said, outside of the therapeutic space or within it, both, we can write letters ourselves. We can write letters to ourselves, from ourselves. We can write letters to and from a struggled with body part, for example. We can write a letter to an attachment figure. That might be a primary caregiver from our infancy or childhood, or it might be a partner, a spouse currently. Writing a letter to the self as though from an attachment figure. So if I was to write a letter to myself as though from my mum, for example, that could be illuminating. Writing to the current self from an older and wiser self, and I've done this. So imagining Nicole, a very wise old Nicole, I don't know, maybe in my 90s or something, looking back on my life, what would I say to myself now? And writing myself a letter from that perspective. Dear Nicole, from Nicole. Writing to us from the heart of a loved one, from a pet even. I remember my childhood dog, Sebastian. If Sebastian were to write me a letter, what would that look like? And I can have a go at writing that down, and it would be marvellous, because dogs sort of throw themselves at us with unconditional love, don't they? I think we're the best thing since sliced bread, so that might be helpful. They could be unsent, these letters, or they might occasionally be sent, and they might be shared with therapists or not. And in one sense, they are transitional objects. So Donald Winnicott, psychoanalyst and sort of developmental psychologist, he worked very much in the area of child development, spoke about transitional objects. So as small children, we often had a dummy, a blanket, a teddy bear, to soothe ourselves in that space, from being soothed from a primary caregiver to being able to soothe ourselves without such an object. And actually letters can serve that same purpose. They can also be used for soothing. And if I were to write myself a letter from that childhood dog to Nicole from Bassie, Sebastian, my dog, it would say very many lovely things about me, because he did love me with all of his doggy heart. And I could read that in times when I'm feeling very down on myself, and that could somehow be a transitional object, an object of soothing. until I'm able to assimilate and internalize some of those more positive aspects that Bassi knew about me, but that I often lose touch with and forget. So, before we move on, interim activity, I'd like us to have a go at writing a few letters, gosh, we don't have that much time, a few sentences in a letter format to a chosen body part. And I'm suggesting this format. So if you've got your piece of paper and pencil there, have a go. If you want to pause this, if you're watching later, to give yourself a bit more time. So dear, and the body part that perhaps you're struggling with, or perhaps the body part that you really love. Thank you for, so it could be something simple. So if it was dear nose, thank you for smelling the lavender. Thank you for alerting me to danger by smelling the burning in the kitchen when I'm making toast, or whatever it is. And you know, that perhaps I need to open a window. I feel, and then something, how you feel towards that body part, an honest sentence about, and that could be painful. You know, I feel you're too big, I feel you're ugly, I feel you're hideous, I feel I wish you were a different way. And a because, if you feel so moved to. And then I'd like to, but this isn't what you'd like to change about that body part. I'd like you to be smaller. You know, you can do if you have more time, but I would suggest also, if you do that, and certainly in this space, perhaps focus on what you would change about, what you'd like to change about how you feel about that body part. So I'd like to come to accept you as you are, or I'd like to see you as others see you, whatever comes to mind and to heart, and then from and your name. So just take a moment or two now. We'll give just a few moments of space. And whilst we're doing that, or if you've completed that or feel like doing it later, and I do recommend having a go, I'd also like to add that it can be really interesting and beneficial to do this with your non-dominant hand. So I'm right-handed, so it's really interesting for me to do this in written form with my left hand, because then we're accessing the kind of emotional hemisphere of the brain, the right hemisphere of the brain. So often we go into cognitions and thinking, and actually there's something about the therapeutic writing process, the creative writing process, that invites us outside of that, into the felt sense, into the emotions. And that's can be more readily and easily accessed through the non-dominant hand. So that can be interesting. And what I also find really helpful is writing to and from myself. So perhaps writing to Nicole, or to an older, wiser self, asking what they do about a certain situation, and then putting the pen into the non-dominant hand and answering from the wise self with the other hand. Again, often I find things bubbling up and coming down onto the page that I don't think would have done with my dominant hand, because I'm accessing a different part of myself, I suppose. All right, and if we were here in person, we'd have a whole group sharing and reflection. If there's anything you wanted to put in the Q&A about how you found that, or even a sentence from what you wrote down, you're very, very welcome to do so. All right, so I'm aware of the time, and I want to leave enough at the end for us to do a collaborative writing activity. So we're going to move on to stories. So again, an invitation to take a moment to reflect on what stories stood out to you from your childhood. What were your favourite stories? What were the books that you returned to again and again, the ones that you begged to mummy, daddy, primary caregiver to read to you? Which, if any, characters did you identify with? And it can be interesting to think about, if there were numerous characters you identified with, is there something common? Is there a commonality there? When I think about the stories that I was really drawn to, it really interests me that a lot of the characters were either abandoned or adopted. Oliver Twist, Emily of New Moon, Anne of Green Gables, Jane Eyre. fascinating to me. And I remained with my family of origin, even though my parents later split. And yet often I didn't feel that sense of belongingness, and I often yearned to feel like I belonged in a stronger way. So I wonder if that might be that draw towards those characters, but on the other side also a draw to those characters. They're all very strong and independent. They had to find their own way. They didn't have necessarily a family system propping them up. They had to forge their own identities, and perhaps there was something in that spoke to me too. So thinking about what these stories and characters might reveal to us about our core values. And I'd really recommend taking time with that to think about, what are your values? What's important to you? What drives you? And often these can be revealed through the sorts of stories and poems that we are drawn towards. And then what might they say about our sense of self? We can be drawn to characters that we identify with, and also those that we aspire to. You know, me perhaps being drawn to like strong female characters, aspiring myself to have that independence and that sort of strength of spirit. And also what characters irritate us, because that can reveal disowned selves, you know, bits of ourselves we put into the shadows, bits of ourselves we find uncomfortable. Now, if we're irritated, for example, by very sort of showy characters, maybe we've disowned that part of ourselves that can walk into a room and say, here I am, and I deserve to be here. So all of these things can be interesting to reflect upon. And rereading those stories from childhood. You're never too old to read a picture book. You're never too old to read a fairy tale. I love to sit there and read my book of fairy tales. And it's they're stories that stand the test of time because they say something very deep often about the human experience. All stories do in some way, and we'll come to that as well. And we'll come to it now. So you may have come across this. This is Joseph Campbell's idea. Joseph Campbell is a mythologist. He's died, but the Joseph Campbell Foundation continues, and he looked at stories across religions, cultures, and across time, and found that very often they tend to follow this trajectory, this hero's journey. And here it is depicted in a visual form, infographic form. So he describes 17 stages, and you can read about that in The Hero with 1,000 Faces. It's a book I really, really recommend. And those 17 stages are broken up into 3 acts or sections. So there's a departure, there's a separation. And if we think about that in terms of BDD, there's sort of the beginning of that struggle, if you like, a separation from a felt sense of our own goodness, you could say, or a departure from that, and a stepping into a world in which the focus is about the contours of the jaw, or the amount of hair, or whatever it is that the preoccupation is pinned onto. There's some kind of initiation, and then there's some kind of return. So to put it more plainly, there's the hero, and we're all heroes. We're all heroes of our own stories, of our own lives. And we receive a call to go on an adventure. Now, it might sound a bit strange to think about the beginning of BDD being a call to adventure, and yet somehow it is a call to some sort of an epic journey, an abyss, a darkness. And something that Joseph Campbell also said is that at the darkest moment comes the light. And we find this again and again in fairy tales, in stories. If you look at some of the modern books and stories, at the darkest moment comes the light, just when you think, and in films, just when you think it's all lost, just when you think it's over for that hero, that protagonist, a possibility emerges. They find their treasure, they're saved, they meet their greatest fear and find it isn't as fearful as they thought it was. So the hero goes off on this call to adventure, this separation. They face tasks or trials. And there's then this kind of central crisis, the really, really dark moment. I guess what people might say in common parlance as the rock bottom moment. And then at that moment, in some way, comes the light. There's some sort of a treasure within that, within the darkness. It's also this idea of the black sun. The light doesn't exist outside of the darkness. It's somehow within it. There's some sort of treasure there in the desperate and difficult struggle that is BDD. And I don't say that lightly as someone that struggled myself for many years. There's something in it. It's our story. It's a call to rediscover our identity. It's a call to rediscover that we are indeed good as we are. And then returning to the world, if you like, returning to day-to-day life, if we've been maybe not leaving the house, or impacted with work or socialization, or impacted in our mind, returning to perhaps a more usual way, or a more open way of being able to think and experience the world with this treasure, with this new understanding of ourselves. And it's not to say that this just happens once. For some people it might. Some people might have that golden aha moment, and then there's a return, if you like. You might use the word recovery, or recovered, and then that person takes all that they've assimilated into their life going forwards. But more typically, it's something that's repeated, and we see this again in the stories and in the movies. As heroes, we go on multiple adventures, and sometimes within the same adventure, within the same struggle, if we're thinking about BDD, we make these cycles lots of times. And it's also to be remembered that each time we go back to that abyss, that bit at the bottom, that kind of death, if you like, that devastating moment, and it's a metaphorical death. I'm not talking about a death of the body, although that can sadly happen in the context of BDD. But in that metaphorical death, there is a rebirth, there's a coming out of that. If we go into that many times, it's trying to hold on to the fact that each time we go back into it, if we do cycle back into it, we go back into it with more resources than we had before, because we've made this journey, and when we've learned things along the way, and we've still got our treasure from the last time. That treasure might be something as simple as I know I have a tool for soothing myself in difficult moments. That treasure might be discovering somebody in our life that's really supportive, a friend that's really understood our struggle and taken the time to listen and support us. They may still be there if we go back into that abyss again, and we can use them as a resource. So the message is not to give up. And we see that in the hero's journey, to keep going, actually. And to finish, I'd like to just talk about poetry. It's my very favourite subject, and it's the thing that's helped me the most. As someone myself who's had lots of different kinds of therapy, and done a lot of sort of personal work, and lots of it has been helpful, some of it has been less than helpful. Writing poetry for me has been incredibly supportive. There's something, and reading it, there's something about the metaphors contained within poems that support an aha moment, a moment where we kind of get something in a way that's often beyond words. It's difficult to describe. That's what poetry does, even though it is words. It's the space in between the words. It's that falling into the metaphor that often reveals something to us that was kind of there dancing in the shadows, but was dimly felt. And suddenly it makes sense in some sort of way. And it's often a felt making of sense. Not necessarily we can say, oh, now I've understood this. Well, sometimes that's possible. So Robert Frost, one of my favourite poets, actually says that the poem is a series of revelations for both the writer of the poem and the reader of the poem. And it's those fresh metaphors. We'll come on to that, because we'll have a think about metaphors. And also the rhythm and sounds of poetry. You know, poetry has a certain rhythm, a certain cadence. That in and of itself is very supportive. If we think about the brainstem and how the brain develops from the bottom up, and if we think about ourselves as babies, so I've got a newborn at the moment. That's why my word retrieval isn't very good. Or that's what I'll blame it on, is the sleep deprivation. But I'm finding it really tricky at the moment to find the right words for things. and I'm enjoying being a mother tremendously. This little one is he's my first. He's just 11 weeks old, and it's so fascinating to me how it's all about rhythm. I have to bounce in a certain rhythm to soothe him. The way I use my voice rhythmically, and it's that brainstem. It's that repetitive, rhythmic, patterned, predictable movement that soothes us. Poetry can do that. The beat of the drum can do that. Music can do that. Dance can do that. And that's an invitation to read poetry out loud, because there's something about the reading of it and the hearing of it in and of itself that can be really, really healing. Even if we don't necessarily understand all the words, there's lots of poems I love, and I couldn't really tell you the meaning, but there's something that happens in my chest when I read them. It's like a lightning or a joy. And I think it's more the cadence and the rhythm, and perhaps part of my unconscious that grasps something that my conscious mind can't quite grasp. So these are some helpful criteria when we're choosing poems, and I do recommend avoiding poems that are full of known cliches, cold as ice, or known metaphors as well. And when we write poetry, it's really helpful to see if we can come up with our own metaphors for things. As cold as ice, or when I feel cold inside, what does it actually feel like to me? To go back to the somatic sense of it. What other metaphor might I use? So ambiguous poems can be helpful because there's often multiple interpretations. And then this idea of the ISA principle that's used in music therapy. So if we're using poems for therapeutic benefit, it's helpful to match poems to a current state of being, and then use those as a springboard into new states of being. So for example, if I'm in a place where I'm really struggling, being given lots and lots of hopeful poems might just not sit, it jars. It's not where I am. And it's not to say that we therefore give a person loads of dark poems, and there's plenty of those, and there's nothing wrong with them either, but that can also come with its difficulties, because it can lead to rumination and even heightened states of hopelessness. So it's that balance, perhaps offering something that's meeting that person where they're at, meeting ourselves where we're at, and then something that might take us to a slightly different place. And we can use those poems as springboards for our own expressive writing. We might write back to the poet. We might choose a particular word in the poem and use that as a starting point for our own poem. We might take a theme or a metaphor and write our own piece of writing around that theme or metaphor, and then matching the poems to therapeutic goals. And within the context of BDD, I don't tend to, if I'm myself using poems to work with people, I don't tend to use poems that specifically about appearance. Again, we're trying to almost, firstly, we're acknowledging that at its heart, it isn't actually about appearance, that that's somehow a smokescreen or what the distress is pinned onto, but also there's an invitation to sidestep that and to think about what's underneath that, the loss, the trauma, the feeling of misunderstood, the power differentials, the threat, as we spoke about at the beginning, that we've experienced in our lives. So when reading poetry or listening to it, there's an invitation to really listen and respond with the whole body, just to take a moment to feel into the sensations of it, and not to necessarily jump to labels too quickly. Oh, that made me feel sad. What do I mean by that? Oh, there was a sense of a drop of a weight in my chest. My shoulders became tight. There was a feeling of heat in my lower spine. Really going back to the sensations within the body can be helpful to really connect with our felt experience of our bodies, but also can help us to make that leap of understanding within the poem. I suppose what I'm trying to say is that sometimes things can be glossed over. Oh yeah, that's a sad poem. Okay, let's read it again and really feel into it. And then we might have a sense more of, or an experience more of a revelation within it. And some reactions and experiences can't be put into words. So to finish, I'm just going to read you a poem that I wrote in the very midst of my struggle with anorexia and body dysmorphic disorder. I invite you to listen with your whole body, and particularly to perhaps pay attention to any metaphors that stand out to you. The pretending game, day and night, each seeking, fearing, voiceless scene, a fortress in the bedroom of our journey, silent and white, pressing against the dawning light. Selves split and spirits aching, a twisting, grating, reckless play, a prison in the labyrinth of our being, capricious and black, throbbing against the passage back. Curtains lift as emotions surface. Little puppet, wake up, find your flesh and your bones. The phoenix is rising, each denial known is pulsing amidst the ache to come home. Love ends the circling and tears down the theatre, our place to hide. Space blown open wide for us to dance in. So perhaps have a feel into any images or metaphors that stood out to you, why that might be, how you might use a poem like that in your life and work, or how you might respond to it if such a poem was shared with you. Noticing that it ends on a hopeful note, and selecting poems that end on a hopeful note, even those that are themselves quite dark, for want of a better word, can be beneficial. And here are some of the metaphors that I just seem to use again and again and again in my poems. And that can be helpful if you're someone who writes a lot, to go through your journals, go through your letters, go through your poems and think, what do I keep going back to? For me, I keep going back to puppets, my idea of myself as a puppet, as a wooden girl, the idea of a prison, the idea of a theatre, being on a stage somehow, and this idea of a labyrinth again and again and again and again. And the interesting thing about a labyrinth is that there's one way, and that way leads into the centre. And yet you have to keep going backwards. And the thing with a labyrinth is, if you begin to question yourself and take it to be a maze, then you might turn around and go back the other way and think, oh no, I'm not going into the middle because I seem to be going backwards. But actually with a labyrinth, you just keep walking. Yes, you keep going backwards, but you just keep walking and you go to the centre. You keep going, you keep on keeping on. That is a theme that comes out all the time in my writing. So interesting for me to reflect on that, to reflect on how I feel like a puppet, a wooden girl, or at least did for many, many years, and how I found my flesh and my bones, as I explained in the poem. And this idea of the curtains lifting on a theatre, you know, this idea of a false self, a pretense self, a mask, if you will, and rediscovering, if you like, my authentic sense of self outside of any stagedness, you know, the true identity, if you like. So I want to spend the last little bit of time having a go ourselves. So I'll leave this with you, and this is a slide you can go back to, just thinking about the steps when we're using poems as part of the therapeutic process. So we might go through a recognition stage, an exploration stage, and then a decision stage, a decision to apply any discoveries that we've had within the process of reading or writing the poems to our lives. And I'll also leave you with some key questions to ask yourself or others if you're working with poetry with others, and some ideas of starter activities for yourselves or for using in the therapeutic space. For example, free writing in response to a piece of music. A word tree is interesting. So starting with a single word, all the words that associate with that word off in branches, and then each of those words off into branches. That in and of itself can make a very, very beautiful poem. Okay. All right. Thank you for your kind. There's some really lovely messages there in the Q&A, and I thank you so much. I'm glad you found my little poem helpful in some way, touching in some way. All right, so I want us to have a go for the last little bit of time. So this is my invitation to you, and please pop it in the Q&A. And if you just use the Q&A for that for the next 2 minutes, so that then I can read it out as a poem, that would be really helpful. And if anyone is willing to have a hopeful line, if you could just say and put your either raise your hand or in the Q&A box just say yes, I'd like to do that, and we'll actually finish with your line because we spoke about finishing on a hopeful note. So if you think about a body part, a line, anything, it doesn't have to be polished or poetic, just a line, a sentence about that body part. Don't necessarily mention it by name, the nose, the ear, the whatever it is, although if you do, it's fine. But the poem will work better if you just write a line without the name of the body part. When I say consider all the senses, I'm not talking about getting all of the 8 senses into your one line. I mean, that would be phenomenal. But think, if you're stuck, think about, well, okay, could I think about my sense of touch, and what I can say about this body part in relation to that, or smell, or what I see, what I hear, and what I've heard other people say about that body part, all of these different things. And if you want to come up with your own metaphors, that would be lovely. But there's no need for metaphor. As I say, it doesn't have to be anything special, just a line about that body part. So let's see if we've got any volunteers for a hopeful line. Not yet. If not, then I can add something. All right, so let's open the floor. In the Q&A box. Thank you, I've got one line already. That's wonderful, I appreciate that. In the Q&A box, please pop your line in there now. I'll just give you 1 minute to do that. Remember, this is anonymous. I won't read your name with your line at all. And Cecilia, you feel free to add a line as well if you would like. Either in the chat if you can't do the Q&A, or because you're also a moderator, or in the Q&A. We've got a hopeful line there. Thank you for that. Okay, I'll just give you 1 more minute. Okay, last 20 seconds. Please put your line in. Can be very simple, can be short. And thank you so much for contributing to our group poem this afternoon, that in some way speaks to the experience of BDD. All right, so I'm going to read our group poem to you without using any names. And what I might do is use a bit of repetition as well, as often can happen in poems. And if I miss your line, I'm so sorry. I'm scrolling through the Q&A in order to do this, and it's a funny thing to do. But let's have a go. This is our group poem. Furry, ugly shame. Bumps and craters like the surface of the moon. A body tired and aching with frustration. She breaks free from the reflection, and it does not hold the power she thought she did. As distinctive and characterful as the summer, life pulses as waves through a being that is imperfect, yet not broken, always whole. My spirit breathes through you, yet you seem like a mangled face on my face. Furry, ugly shame. Furry, ugly shame. Life pulses as waves. She breaks free from the reflection, and it does not hold the power she thought it did. My spirit breathes through you, always whole. That's beautiful. Thank you. Just had a couple more come in, and I'm sorry that I've completed our poem now, but they're also lovely lines. We've got here, the shackles of pain have fallen from my shame. Now I am arising again. And this idea of arising, thank you for sharing that, is something also I find myself often, it's a metaphor that comes out all the time in my writing. This idea of a phoenix rising from the ashes comes up again and again. So this sense that we can rise up somehow. There it is. The phoenix is rising, each denial known is pulsing amidst the ache to come home. And that homecoming is not some physical place on this earth, but rather a place within us, a place of remembering that we are good as we are, a place of having a connection to the richness of our being, all the aspects that make up who we are, a connection to the true self. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen there. I do hope that was interesting, and I thank you so much for your courage of spirit, both in coming but also in sharing there for our group poem. It's been really, really lovely to have this time with you today.